Do this every time, and it always turns out we are live, but why not break the habit at this point? Welcome everybody that's here. Thank you for showing up. I think you're here because you're an MSP or a business that's concerned about cybersecurity. I know the world's broken because anytime I post a picture of my case with stickers on it, I get 20,000 views, and anytime I say the word cybersecurity, I get 7. I have to imagine you are here for the cybersecurity. Today, we're here to talk about, kind of a legislation that has been passed. It has been signed into law. It is in its infancy and is starting to go forward, and it's around cybersecurity reporting. And so I've got some smart folks with me here today. You know Dom and I, so we don't need to introduce. And you've already known Mr. Cromar, the poutine king of the world himself. But Ian and Wes, if you don't mind, kick off a little quick introduction, and then Ian, if you'll read into the audience of what are we here talking about today.
Yeah, Ian Richardson from Richardson Consulting. I'm a recovering MSP owner after 16 years in the game.
Fantastic. And I'll go next. It's funny you use that term. So you've got Wes Spencer here. I'm a recovering bankster. I come out of financial services, deep insight and background into like threat intel. I've worked in regulated industries for quite a while. And after that, I went over to start a company called Perch Security. We sold to ConnectWise a little over a year ago and spent a stint there as their VP and external CISO. And now I'm kind of doing some things all on my own at the moment. So thanks for having me.
We might touch on that at the end of this if we've got time, and I'll go ahead and let everybody know if you comment on this or chat, we'll show it live, and we can answer questions for you while you have this panel here. But Ian, what is the legislation about? What got passed?
Yeah, so the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022, or CIRCIA, and how you want to pronounce that's up for debate.
Yeah, let's define it now. Is it Circia? Have we spoken?
I think it's Circia. I think we're going to go on record as Circia.
We got to go Circia. Like I was saying before, it's Game of Thrones characters' names.
That's right.
It just rolls through the tongue nicely.
That's right. Yeah, so Circia is law. It was rolled into an Appropriations Act that President Biden signed March 15th. And so there's kind of 3 big takeaways on this. One, the CISA, or the CISA, is the regulatory body that is in control of creating what's called rulemaking for this law. And all that means is that CISA is the federal agency that says this is how you comply, this is what you must do. So that's first takeaway.
Which is interesting to note, right? Because CISA has been a Department of Homeland Security. We've seen a lot of things about it around election fraud and things in that nature. But this is kind of one of the first regulatory reporting acts that is actually now going to bring data directly to CISA as opposed to the other way around in general, I think, as I understand it, right?
Correct. And so it's interesting. Part of the act requires mutual information sharing. So all federal agencies that have some sort of incident are required. All federal agencies that have an incident of any way, shape, or form are required to report that back to the CISA. But the CISA is also required to share information out. And that's an interesting little tidbit that I want to circle around to a little bit later in the cast, is that sharing of information out, because not all federal agencies are as benevolent as the as CISA. Or CISA, as you mentioned it. I don't know. Pronunciation is going to be a battle here.
Well, and it gets even more confusing because you have CISA, the act, right? And then CISA, the governmental agency. So
keeping it easy.
Absolutely correct.
Unless they get a waiver.
So the second big takeaway is that any incident where someone makes a ransom payment or a covered cyber incident has to be reported.
Yeah.
And covered cyber incident is a significant, broad basis point. So the big points that are in the act is that if there is a substantial loss to the CIA triad of an organization, the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an impacted organization, and substantial is not defined. So we've got that.
Yeah. Does that mean that outside of the act, substantial could just be a simple guidance situation? Is that essentially what that allows for?
So what happens is substantial is allowed to be defined by the regulator. So the regulatory body will define what substantial means. If it impacts the safety or resiliency of operational systems, again, safety and resiliency are not defined. So we've got some definitions that'll come down from regulators here. If it disrupts the business or industrial operations, so if there's a denial of service attack, for example, a system goes down.
You could see this getting pretty broad right now, right? Like if as you just kind of comma space each next one of those, you've really included 80% of most incidents at this point.
So here's the other big one, is that if it results in unauthorized access to an information system, or it has a compromise in supply chain, meaning impact to a CSP or an MSP, you're hit by this.
Yeah.
So MSPs take note right there.
Yeah. That's the critical aspect.
Yeah, this is something I was talking about on a live stream last week, is that this is the very first. Now, we've known this is coming down the pipeline for a little while now, because the original documentation was in, I have the notes here because I had to go look it up. Don't think I'm this smart, but it was H.3600. And that got encompassed into this larger omnibus, but that was written last year. So we've seen MSPs be documented in legislature, but this is the first time it's passed into legislation. So this is really interesting because it shows us that they understand the supply chain now, and they understand that MSPs and CSPs, cloud service providers, are critical in the stack of the supply chain.
Yeah, 100%. And, it's interesting you say that, because I think I posted on it when that bill was first introduced, because it was actually defining an MSP. The word MSP existed in the language, right? Like it was talking about this MSP kind of nature of us as service providers. And I think one of the reasons I bring this up, let's just distill it down as to why does this matter? Okay, now you have to report on incidents. Great. It probably assumes you have an incident response plan. It probably assumes you track incidents. It probably assumes you're willing and able to catch incidents. It probably, right? And so we start looking at this as, I believe this is just another step in this maturation of MSPs and of service providers and technologists in general, in that we always think about this. I saw a Facebook ad or a LinkedIn ad where somebody said, it was a meme about, well, if cybersecurity can't stop this, then why do we even try?
Right.
I think it's because people have defined security the wrong way. Everybody thinks about protect, maybe identify. But what about detect and respond and recover? All three of those have more to do with this bill than the I'll put antivirus on, or I'll use a trusted tool, or no, this is all about the operational mechanics of finding it, stopping it, detecting the amount of damage, responding to it and stopping it and containing it, and then ultimately recovering from it. Right? It's a life cycle. And then hopefully learning from that so that you don't have it next time.
Well, this is what we've been preaching this forever.
Yeah.
That, cybercrime is woefully underreported, but the impacts are massive. And I think we've even said at least once, probably more, that, if the private sector doesn't act, the public will. I think this is the public sector acting and being like, man, we don't have data. We don't understand what's happening in the biggest chunk of the economy, and we need to.
Yeah.
So this is kind of them forcing the hand, and to your point, like assuming you can detect incidents.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens when you didn't detect an incident, and maybe the FBI stumbles on some data from your network that was sold? You never reported that, right? So how does that shake down? So this is also a call to action to get yourself into position, implement a framework, be able to detect incidents so that you can actually report them and be in compliance with this law.
One of the things that's interesting there, Dom, that I think is a good point that you brought up, is this idea of reasonable belief that exists in it. So they talk about it, the timer, the 72-hour timer starts when you have reasonable belief. But even that's sticky at the moment, because we don't is it reasonable belief when Wes Spencer, who's a peon at the org, is calling the shots and says, hey, we've been breached? Or is it when CISO or whoever declares an incident?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that we're gonna have to wait for. One thing to just so people don't panic over this is there's right now this sets this in motion. It makes it law, but then rulemaking is going to come out. And so there's going to be a period of time. Yeah. Yes. And it could even happen less than that, but there's going to be over 2 years of allowance of time for the rulemaking. So hopefully we're going to see clarity on this. And if you've never been around like legislation and the way that the motions work for this, what'll happen is the rulemaking will come out and it'll be proposed rulemaking by which you'll see trade organizations and larger industries get together and say, we don't like this, we do like this, can we make these changes? And then they'll have another, I think it's 18 months if they need it, to then put it into full force.
Yep.
And the problem is that whole time, the federal agencies that are trying to figure out how much blood we're even losing, right, are going to be clamoring to try to solve this problem. I mean,
Absolutely.
The reason this bill exists is for the data gathering. It's for the telemetry. It's for the TTPs. It's for the breadth. I mean, when you've got doubleextortion.com being the authoritative source of who's been ransomed, right? Like, that's a problem. Right. And I'll talk about my own kind of like experience with this. And most of you may not know, I had a theory where when we were a very large MSP, I wanted to have a public-private partnership ready. I wanted to have a good channel of communications. I actually met with an FBI agent. I signed up as a confidential informant, which is a lot less confidential now, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I was able to share telemetry in a denatured fashion of the incidents we were gathering. And one of those incidents was one where we bought an MSP. I'll call that MSP Voldemort at this point. But that MSP, we bought them. They were ransomed before we could move them onto our systems. We had to work with the Huntresses and the Friends of the Worlds to try to get to the bottom of it. We brought in breach counsel. I spent 2 years working with breach counsel and forensics response and lawsuits and all the things. And I shared that information with the FBI. The FBI actually came and found me, to Dom's point. So out of the Northern District of Texas, the FBI showed up at my office and said, hey, we found, and I didn't know it at the time, that they were in the back end of these ransomware provider servers, but they found that the timestamps on 6 of my clients were within milliseconds of each other on a ransom. And they deduced that I must have been their service provider, and it was through us, and they were right. I didn't have to report it. It existed in 2019 prior to the egression and double extortion. So I was actually ruled not a breach, and I didn't have to report, and I didn't have to do any of those things, right? But they came to me, and then they wanted to make an arrest based on that. And so I was the victim in the Northern District of Texas that signed for the Soda Nakibi Our Evil ransomware gang arrests that happened by the FSB this year. And so I didn't notice it again. This was in July of last year until I saw the FBI agents standing on the stage with DOJ in November of 2021 saying, hey, we're putting sanctions and we're going to arrest these guys. And I'm like, where the hell is the reverse sharing, gents? What about a phone call before you go on stage with my information? Like, how about maybe? And so, like, I wanted to bring it back to your point, Ian. Like, what are your concerns around this, like, two-way street conversation with the feds?
So there's there's 2 parts to this. The third big takeaway is that you've got a covered entity bubble. And so covered entity is one of my favorite. Oh, there goes Wes. But covered entity is one of my favorite items in federal law because near and dear to my heart is CFR 45, which is HIPAA. And if you look at covered entities under there, it's a broad basis point. It's a hugely broad basis point when it comes to who's a CE. And by
in this, you mean specifically in this act as to the critical infrastructure covered entity?
Exactly. Critical infrastructure sector. So big thing to think about, were you allowed to stay open during government shutdowns? Right. If the answer is yes, you are probably going to be tapped as a critical infrastructure. MSPs are going to be tapped. IT service providers are going to be tapped themselves as a critical infrastructure. But most of our clients are going to be critical infrastructure too. Manufacturing, healthcare, financial services, energy, transportation, logistics, all of those are going to be critical infrastructure. You support a hospital, a surgery center, something like that, things that were kept open throughout the entirety of pandemic. Those clients are going to be critical infrastructure. They're going to be subject to this reporting.
Yeah, so, Wes kicked this link of that aspect here. Wes, you want to touch on this then?
Sure. So this is the actual directive that's referenced if you want to see the full and actual list. Now, this could change at some point in time. And John Strand, for example, from Black Hills, is frustrated by this because he says, well, wait a second, everyone should be critical infrastructure, right? Why are we designated? But I see where it's coming from. If you scroll down quite a bit, Matt, you'll see the actual list. And there's an evolution here that I think is important to understand. A lot of this, not all of this, but a lot of it did get kicked off with President Obama's White House. They set in motion the NIST to have governance over what a security framework looks like. They set in motion the actual creation of not ISACs. ISACs existed before this, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, but they did. But President Obama did set the designation of what these critical infrastructure is, and then the capabilities of how the ISACs are to support that mission on the SSA side. And then what happened was you also saw this evolution of how do we facilitate cyber threat intel sharing, which is what CISA, the act was. This was in 2015. And then that sort of kicked in motion. Okay, now we have conduits by which private industry can share with public industry. And then you see the formation of CISA, the agency. And now we're at this Incident Reporting Act. It's a really fun timeline of events that we see kind of go through. It's fun for me because I'm a dweeb, right?
Yeah,
but you see this stuff happening. This is not the end of it. This is just the next evolution in the line. But this does give us the capability of sharing these cyber incidents under the guise of what CISA allowed from 2015 to say, this is protected information. So if I share these things with the federal government, which now I have to, before it was optional. But now if I'm critical infrastructure, I have to. But this is protected from subpoena. It's protected from the FOIA stuff, the Freedom of Information Act, and it's actually protected from lawsuits. Now, it's tricky because if some of that information goes to a different conduit and it gets discovered, it could still be subpoenaed in a different form or fashion, but the actual reporting itself is protected. So it's really interesting to kind of see how this goes.
Yeah. Made a link for it, shortener for you, so it's CI Scope, just so you don't have to type that in or copy and paste it if you're watching this. The other thing about it is that because of my partnership with the FBI, one thing I learned is that ever since the Obama administration, the FBI has been operating under a mandate of not re-victimizing the victim, right? In the sense of, if you happen to share this information with us, we're not here to deal with your Department of Justice situations and your other things. We're here literally just to deal with this incident. We don't want to re-victimize you. We're not going to arrest you for things we find during this. And while that's a bit of a directive and it's not a law, I feel like maybe this same type of privileged information piece is coming across. And for anybody that's not, super in the cyberspace, like imagine fighting a war where you don't know where the enemy is. Imagine fighting a war when you don't understand the terrain. Imagine fighting a war when you have no idea what battlefield even looks like. This is kind of where we find ourselves in a cybersecurity perspective. Like we as a federal government entity for sure, but even as the general community don't have data sharing in the way that we would envision, right? Sticks and Taxi were only made 10 years ago, 10 years ago. ISAC's ISAL participation has really only started sparking off, especially in the SMB space over the last, Wes, what would you say? 5 years, 2 years?
5, yeah.
The information is not good. And when you get to the federal, because of that fear of stigmatization, fear of federal involvement, I was fighting everything I could do not to have to report something, right, in a former life. And so I think this is kind of just showing the problem that exists, in that if we're going to start fighting this and making adequate legislation or making adequate, threat defenses, we got to have the data. And so it kind of seems like that's what this is really aimed to do. If you were an MSP tomorrow, Wes, and you were trying to plan for what does this act mean to you, what would you do? What would be the takeaway? The one Wes advice, Papa Wes advice.
We have a gap. And we actually don't yet have, in my mind, a cybersecurity focused trade group of sorts that sort of takes the charge for us. Let me say how I would do it in the banking space. So I would probably be a member of American Bankers Association or Independent Community Bankers Association. So we use ICBA. ICBA primarily serves, banks $2 billion in assets and down, sometimes a little bit larger. But what would happen is as soon as this legislation came out, they would have a bunch of webinars, a bunch of data coming out saying this, like what we're doing here. This is what it's talking about. This is what it's doing. And then here's what we're going to do on your behalf. Some people call this lobbying, right? And it can be that way. But lobbying is not always evil. And so they would say, we've got this for you. We're going to be watching as members. You get to have input to us, and we will be your facilitator as this goes down the pipeline so we can steer it in the best way that works for us. We don't really have that. And that's a little bit scary for MSPs because if we don't have it, we're not going to really have a lot of conduit and capability to help steer this in mass. In other words, it's going to be a whole bunch of individual ones of us trying to like make sure we have a piece in the pie. And that's scary because, as you guys said from the beginning, MSPs are mentioned here and the supply chain is evident in this. And so I'm a little fearful, if I'm an MSP, of who's going to drive this message and make sure that our best interests are kept at heart so that we don't get trampled on. So I'm a little scared, Matt. Fortunately, we have time in the rulemaking process for that to formulate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the point that I would give, and maybe let's go around the room, let's do this advice, right? If you're an MSP and you're trying to figure this out and decide what do you do out of this legislation today, and then maybe we'll go back on another round and talk about what do we do in 6 months? Like, what do we do in a year? I like the advice, though, Wes, of trying to get a voice, right, at this stage. We don't have it organically. I mean, I'd say CompTIA and the ISAC there is probably the closest in some of their capabilities. But I do love that. So that's the first piece. We'll go around, kind of give the advice, and then we'll come back and talk about the kind of the teeth of the legislation, what this means as well. So go ahead, and Ian, do you have any advice for MSPs out there today around this and what they can do to be ready for this law, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of three things. Setting up a Google News alert or your news aggregator of choice on the acronym of the law is a good way to get your pulse checked, right? So as this law drops, as news comes up, you can bet that when prelim rules are sent out, it'll hit the news wire. So keep an eye on the news wire. Don't live, eat, and breathe this, but kind of keep a pulse on that to get an idea of when rules are published or prelim rules are published.
I want to take a sec to say something about someone posted. David said, in the National Society of IT Service Providers, Carl Polachak, Amy Babinak, and team are set up to form this type of guidance. I think their formation speaks towards the need for this formation in general, right? I think we're all starting to grapple with that understanding. Thanks for that, David. Appreciate it.
Second real piece is if you're not having a conversation internal to your organization as well as with your clients about security being part of business strategy. Security isn't a line item on a budget.
It's not your antivirus product, right?
This is not about layering product after product after product after product. This is about stance. This is about the way we design an organization, and that involves policy and procedure. That involves HR, that involves hiring and firing, that involves technological design and infrastructure. But it's a much bigger picture than just, hey, we got to throw an EDR on things, or we need to have a security operations center monitoring our stuff or whatever, right? This is not a speeds and feeds conversation. This is a fundamental business strategy conversation. You should be having those talks, right? We had an old financial advising company that was a client at my old MSP that was on an acquisition tear. Security due diligence was a key piece. You don't want your clients to be Marriott buying Starwood, right?
Starwood guest preferred, indeed. So
yeah, let's start having those conversations about security as a strategy. Yeah. Third is don't be in a vacuum anymore. So get your team out there, get exposure, start talking with your peers, start talking with the other guys in town, right? Rising tide raises all boats and everything. But get out there and don't try to eat this in a vacuum. Just talk with others in the space, talk with others about their best practices. Try to start slowly but surely increasing your stance on cybersecurity. Those are the big three things, right? Get that visibility and start to make a plan.
I left this up here just because I don't know who you are, LinkedIn user. I'm going to go check afterwards, but I'm married. But if I wasn't, 100%, right? Like I preach this so much. Have a framework, damn it. Have something you can have defensively saying, I went through each of these steps and made sure that I was securing myself, and I take my clients through the same. And they'll speak towards incident response. They'll speak towards reporting. They'll speak towards those things.
Well, to add to that, I like CIS. I know you like CIS. NIST is great too. But I think you'll see these frameworks, specifically CIS, because NIST is a federal agency, it's going to be slow. But I think CIS will react pretty quick. They'll start to create mechanisms in their controls for this act as it relates to reporting. And they'll also do it with the assumption that this will become a more international trend.
Yeah.
So I think, but you're right. You need to adopt a framework. If you don't have one, you are flying blind. It is what it is, right?
And you're saying you're the smartest guy or gal in the room.
Right. And that's what you don't want to say,
ultimately.
especially in a courtroom, because that's what could happen, right?
Every time I've tried that approach, people make fun of me.
It feels like this entire thing boils down to join a peer group, have conversations with your peers, and have a plan of action and be defensible. It's funny. It feels like every stream boils down to like these three things I keep hearing from Dom and Matt, and being defensible is probably the premier thing we talk about all the time. And as a layman on this stream, it's absolutely incredible how many of our peers are not adopting these defensible tactics. And it feels like, simple measures and simply having a conversation with groups allows you to kind of sit back and say, wow, I need to take better steps. I need to be doing this proactively. So it's kind of great to just sit back and listen to Wes and Ian talk through this stuff. So
they're the smart ones.
Cool. Yeah. It's really great to just kind of hear your guys' perspective.
So last thought experiment. It's a year from now. Legislation's in place. We have guidance. We're reporting. And you're an MSP that has decided, I'm not going to do it. I don't care. Let's talk about what are the implications of not doing this? What are the teeth? Why does it matter?
So I'll get started on that, and then I'll need to drop, if that's okay, to my next thing. So one thing that's important to really understand is at this point, we're still waiting for the rulemaking to come out to understand the specifics, but it did set teeth. And I think I hate to say it, but good regulation needs teeth. Otherwise, people are not going to follow it. They're just not. And there's some scary teeth that's in here, but I think it shouldn't be scary, right? So let me kind of explain the way this works, right? So if you choose not to follow the 72-hour notification and you just say, I'm not doing it, and I willfully knew that we had some kind of incident, but maybe I didn't know this legislation exists, maybe I did, doesn't matter, and you don't do something about it, what can happen is CISA, the agency, can subpoena you. They have the authority under this to, that's true too. You'll eventually be a former MSP owner, right? and let's talk about how that's going to happen, right? So what can happen is they can subpoena you and they can say, you now have to, under court of law, send me X amount of information, which is pretty scary. But the good news is if you comply to the subpoena, then it counts as if you published it within the 72 hours. So this is very
Which is like a mea culpa, right? Like it's just a
really
free mea culpa.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the way it currently is. Rulemaking could change this, but that's the way it currently is. So I feel like that is very, very, very friendly towards like SMBs are going to be caught in the middle of this. However,
and it speaks to the lack of maturity. Like they're trying to speak towards maybe they won't know.
It seems like they get it.
Here, right?
Now, here's where it gets scary. Where it gets scary is if you still don't comply to the subpoena. And that's when it gets really dangerous, because then you can have civil penalties, which mean fines. So individuals and organizations can be fined. And once they do finally get their information, because let's be honest here, the subpoena will turn up information. And this turns into like, remember when Uber had their very first breach?
Oh, yeah.
Hit the information.
Should have gone to jail.
Yeah. An event like this, that might happen, because if we see, if CISA sees this is significant cover up, blah, 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 you can see the writing here that they have the ability to do one of two things. They can hand this over to DOJ to then prosecute criminally. That's legit in here. Or two, enforcement actions by a regulatory agency. In other words, for example, if you're a bank, then the regulatory agency that has enforcement over you, be it FDIC, OCC, Fed, whoever it may be, has the capability to come in and take regulatory action on you. And that's pretty scary, because then all sorts of manners of things can happen so it sort of like forwards it over to that group. Yeah. So there's teeth to this.
Too, when the civil suits start flying, it's very indefensible in court to say, well, I also ignored the federal government.
Yeah, I was also so incompetent that I didn't report it, couldn't report it, and ignored the subpoena from the federal government when they asked for it. Yeah.
So you'll be a very broke former MSP owner, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I got to jump. Thank you so much
for having me, buddy.
Guys.
See you, Wes.
Yeah, so to piggyback off of what Wes was saying there, when you think about the regulatory bodies, the FBI and the CISA do have a do no harm stance, like Matt was mentioning. Other regulatory bodies have no such stance.
Yeah.
And some of them, for those of you on the call who have gone through OCR audits, I've gone through 3. Some of them have a anti-friendly stance. They're really there to make your life hell.
Yeah.
So anyone who's been involved with a FINRA audit also knows what I'm talking about. So when you go through some of these regulatory bodies where there is information sharing, there is hey, there will be no course of action.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that there may not be attention. So if you're a healthcare body and you had a breach, that does not mean that OCR will not come by and say, hey, we'd like to talk about your policies, procedures, and controls you have in place for compliance with CFR 45. Yep. If you're an SEC regulated entity or a FINRA regulated entity, it does not mean that regulators will not come by and say, hey, we'd like to take a look at the book.
I am so glad you mentioned FINRA, and here's why. No. I was FINRA regulated when I was 19 years old. I passed my Series 7, my 66, my LHVA, and I was a FINRA entity, a broker. But FINRA is a self-regulatory body. Mm-hmm. FINRA is an example of what my vision is for how we solve this. And if you look at what Wes said, or what Wes was saying, hey, other regulatory action might be taking away your license from the FINRA of MSPs, from the FINRA of technology providers, right? I imagine a world where entities like MSPs are a regulated body like a broker-dealer, and entities like a Matt Lee or an Ian Richardson are regulated entities as a one unit, as a human. And you could theoretically see a world where prosecution and or loss of licensure and livelihood are very similar to the way they are in the financial markets. Right, that's how FINRA was born, was out of the needs of the stock market crash in the early, after the 30s and 40s, and things started shaping and driving. We're in that time as MSPs. We're in that time as technologists where the government is starting to understand, wait a minute, this is a problem.
Right.
Right? Cromar, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we'll ever see a self-regulatory or regulatory license model for MSPs that encompasses teachings like this?
We've talked about this before, right? You got to have a license to cut hair. Why would you not need one to manage infrastructure and entire technology networks and ecosystems? And I love the comment from Stephen, right? Like now these MSPs having been defined on paper, it kind of sets the tone for these break fix guys, right? It really does kind of shape what that looks like and what they need to be doing to kind of be at the right level.
Well, and honestly, this is not a negative piece. I'm not a huge regulation type of guy, but it's been wild, wild west for a long, long time. It's too bad Wes is gone. Wild, wild west.
He gets jiggy with it, though. I hear he'll slap you. Oh, sorry. Is that too soon?
You leave early, and you get put on the hot seat for the rest of the cast. But it has been just completely huge spectrum of what is allowable and acceptable in our industry for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And a little bit of policing, whether it be from self-regulation, which would be my stance too. I think that we've got an eminent number of professionals out there who could form a regulatory body and say, hey, here's the minimum standard of what we're going to need to do, to a federal or state-by-state agency sort of system, or by what Heath is saying kind of in the chat, right, where maybe it's not even a regulatory action, maybe it's insurance and financial institutions and things like that kind of come in and say, hey, if you're not meeting these bars, you're not insurable, you're not able to bank with us, you're not able to participate in the system.
Right. Yeah. And I said this, there was a speech that Dom and I did, or a live stream that Dom and I did about insurance a little bit back. And we were talking about these subrogations, right? They're starting to get line signatures from MSPs saying, I filled this form out and everything is true to the best of my knowledge. And I know that, 100%. And if you look back at Salesforce mandating MFA, Heath, I appreciate you giving me this giant fodder right here. But that's also part of this problem. Software vendors have, up till now, it has not been cool to deal with security. So they've never forced these things. Why in the hell can I even make an insecure password in Microsoft? Why in the hell can I not have MFA? And when I've posed this question to vendors in the past, the answer is we're afraid of losing revenue. If we turn this on, we're afraid of losing revenue. Yeah, Ian, great point, right? Yeah. Google enforcing MFA, same conversation. You're starting to see where it's cool, and also, space, attorneys think this is really cool for my organization, for us to force these things on our people, come hell or high water. And it's also this point where we are now in a point where people are asking about security. Well, what is security? It's also Salesforce forcing MFA, Google forcing MFA. While they're transferring risk, in the same way they're reducing risk they've been afraid to in the past. And so I call that acceleration on acceleration
Well, eventually this rolls down to the consumer. Like Google is doing that on consumer accounts with they meet certain conditions. I think you need to be a creator or whatever, but they're getting there. My point is that as a consumer, I am now forced to use MFA, right? On my gmail.com account, if I don't have MFA, well, I can't turn it off, right? I've always had it on. But so I'm now very exposed to that. Even if I wasn't someone in the industry who understood these things, I'm very exposed because I had to set it up. If I go into my Salesforce, where there's probably a lot of data about a lot of people, and I realize that's not happening, I might start to ask questions. Right? That's the kind of consumer that I hope to that these Google mandates and other mandates build is a consumer that's a little bit more aware and can actually start these conversations too.
Yeah,
I think Matt
it's a
brings up a good
maturation.
point. You talked about it not being cool to have security as a software vendor created barriers to entry for people to be utilizing your stuff, right? It was more clicks, more touch. And now, to your point, Dom, the consumers are familiar with these security components, right? Consumers are familiar with MFA and what they have to do to access their banking records or whatever it might be. They're familiar with cybersecurity breaches and threats. People hear this stuff on the news every day. So it's not as crazy to instill this as a Salesforce or other large entity it downstream into your company, your users, etc. Because people are now seeing this stuff in everyday life, right? Like it's no longer crazy for them to have MFA across the board on things they're utilizing.
Right. Well, like one other thing around that is in IT, and this has been the experience for decades, right? So this is not a new problem, but we have done a terrible job at mandating the standards of
being the doctor, right?
Yeah,
like it's being prescriptive.
The problem is we are asking non-technical, non-security focused individuals to make highly complex decisions about basics, like the ability for MFA to even be a conversation.
Right.
No, this is the way it's going. There's no other way that this works now.
Yep.
Right? Like this is sorry, we're doing it.
And once you choose that way, it's education now, right?
Yeah.
It's not decision. It's not fighting for this and hoping they'll, right? It's just education. Oh, your MFA slow? Let me teach you. Let me help show you how this, let me set the right, I think what we're getting to, and I love you for this, Ian, because I've always been this person. This is the way. Like if I had known Mandalorian was coming out, I'd have been a billionaire, right? Like I would just license This Is the Way. Like it would have been the thing. But yeah, 100%. A lot of times you have this interesting mix of MSPs being massively technical and trying to fight it from a technical argument. When this is a business conversation, right? To your point, Ian, this is a business conversation. I love Stephen here saying there's a large local energy company in North Carolina. And if you think about it, it's because they are definitely critical infrastructure, right? That has a questionnaire and a multi-round interview process with a committee in order to be a sub with them. Good. They're trying to realize that it's their job in the absence of any other systemic function to try to sort out the turds from the non-turds. And it can't just be a simple questionnaire anymore. And so I love that, Stephen. Thank you for sharing. Also, one more thing that's just a pet peeve, not super related to this conversation, but it goes back to this. Cybersecurity from a vendor perspective is this histrionics aspect of, I can protect all bad stuff. I'm going to get your computer saved. And yet we let people have local admin privileges where I, as a threat actor, can land and expand, right, without anything stopping me. Because I'm just going to go underneath your antivirus because I have admin, right? I'm just going to, right? And so you get into this world where we are seeing so many of these phases all come together at the same time, right? I imagine we could sit here and riff about all the maturation and maturity we've seen in this industry over the last 5 years that we've not seen in the last 20 years in that respect. And so I love it. Great examples. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you. All right, let's close it out, Ian. This is the end, right? You have one last thing to say to someone about this. What would you ask someone as an MSP to think about around the things we're talking about today, around the actual legislation asking you to report? What else would you give as advice to close this out?
I mean, if you above everything, if you've been waiting for the bell, like it just got rang.
Yeah.
Either get on the boat or get out of the game, guys. Like it's the late adopters, we don't have to prescribe, we don't have to do this, we're going to not roll security in to keep our costs low or whatever, like that ship has sailed.
Yeah.
It is time to get in and start having conversations, because just like the thread has kind of touched on in the chat, and just like we've touched on the panel here, people are coming for us. Threat actors out there know what an MSP is. Insurance companies know what an MSP is. Lawyers know what an MSP is. And the federal government now is defining what an MSP is. If you were waiting for the sign, you just drove by it on the highway. The exit's behind you.
Yeah.
Right.
It's time to start.
Totally.
It's time to get serious about it. Like it's you don't have an option anymore. You have to start materially impacting security at organizations, and you can either see it as the opportunity that it is, or see it as a cost to be managed. But one way or another, you will have to manage this.
Yeah.
So
100%.
it's time to start creating a strategy and moving forward. Right? You can't look back at the good old days. Those are behind us. We're not going that direction anymore.
Yeah. I'll be selfish and go because you kind of queued me up, and then Cromar and Dom, you can close us out. So you know what we didn't say once today? We didn't say MSSP one time.
Oh, that's just an industry term.
Right?
That doesn't exist.
No, but I get in this argument a lot, and this is why I wanted to bring this up. A lot of people say, I don't have to worry about this as an MSP because I'm not an MSSP. I don't want to deal with the security of it. I just want to spin the plates and do the data and the counsel. Guess what, boys and girls? If you touch the data, and data is represented in security by the CIA triad, guess what? You're in security. Welcome to the party.
Right.
And I think that's the point that this makes here. I also want to make a huge plug for SSO.tax that Heath put up, because I personally paid almost $100,000 in SSO tax a year at our MSP that I worked for before, just to try to maintain the standards of SSO. And it does piss me off because it's endemically proving that these vendors are having to charge to fix the things they should have fixed and add these capabilities that they never did. And I love you, vendors. You're on my line card and you're my friend. But these type of things have to stop. We have to start dealing with this as part of business. So thank you. Cromar and Dom, y'all close us out. Who's next? Sorry, Ian, I apologize.
Oh no, well, security just it's basis point, right? And I think y'all at Pax8 have done a good job at advocating for that. So I'm just gonna do a here, right? You cannot charge for security as a software company anymore.
Right.
That is permission.
Oh, you want it to be secure too? I'll sell you the house, but it doesn't come with locks.
Yeah, right? Like, no, you wanted a door here? No.
Oh man, who was making a lean-to? Sorry.
I'll go. I think really what it boils down to is, to Stephen's latest comment around, the government didn't define the MSSP. They defined the MSP. They've bundled everyone under one umbrella. So there is no hiding under, I don't need to worry about this.
Amen.
You absolutely should be thinking about this. So
acronyms don't save you. Just say it, Ian.
Yeah.
Those are good ones. Just say it.
I love that. That's so true. You know, you can't sit in front of a judge in a courtroom and say, well, I had another S in my acronym. So
Your Honor, I only paid for one extra S, sir.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not an MSP. I'm a TSP, so that makes me different.
Yeah. We're good.
That does not care. That fiefdom, you are screwed no matter where you're at when you're in the hot box. So,
true story.
Honestly, the key takeaway I have from this is pretty much the key takeaway we have from a lot of the security conversations we have is be defensible, have your house in order, get your butt in gear, and go do this stuff. To Ian's point, if you weren't already on this train, the conductor just rang the last bell, guys. Like, you have to jump on this train.
Yeah. And you do have time in 6 months, right? Like, you have time to get this going.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a great point. You know, it's time to get on the train. It's leaving, and the train you're on is running out of track. It's going to crash. It's going to derail. You're not going to make it. And it's just the truth of the matter, right? I agree. Like, an MSSP, frankly, is fake, right? It's not a real thing. You cannot be an effective service provider without managing the technology, and you cannot be an effective technology provider without managing security. So They are one and the same.
Now you can outsource some stuff.
Oh, you should,
right?
sure,
Tech tools,
sure.
technology knowledge. I'm not trying to kill the entire security delivery as a service industry.
Right.
Just mean that if you touch the data and the security, you are responsible for it. If
you hit the nail on the head. Build by your partner.
Yep.
Right, and you can do that, but you need to be in charge of what that strategy is, and that means implementing a framework. But right now is the time to make that transition, to start taking security seriously. Work with peers, work with your vendors to help you. We're all here to help you. You can reach out to us anytime. We want you to succeed in this, but please understand that now is the time, right?
Yeah.
This most certainly will not be the last piece of federal legislation we see in this. This is the first one. This is gathering the data so that they can understand what the hell is going on. And once they understand that, they're going to start figuring out how to regulate that.
Yep.
So it's time to get on and take this seriously.
Well, as Dom says, let's take this seriously. And Ian, I have to put this out there. Anytime someone snakes me on something, is ahead of me on seeing some legislation, is ahead of me on certain things, I like to be humble and say it. Ian Richardson is faster than me and smarter than every way. So thank you.
No. Not on that. Just happened to be scrolling through things and saying, I bet you Matt Lee will find this interesting.
Well, I appreciate you, brother. And if anybody doesn't follow Ian already, Ian is a thought leader. Ian is a fantastic coach and is very pragmatic and is someone I'm proud to call friend. So I appreciate you being on here. Everybody that stayed and watched, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Get working on it. And if you have any questions, reach out. I'm here for you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. See you.